Hello, hello, hello. What's up, everybody? This almost turned into a bus, but I am so glad to be with you right now. We have ourselves another gun rights debate, gun rights versus gun control. Just like a few weeks ago, you had Cold of Ham versus the BTK, and now we have TwoPlebs and the Effeminate Degenerate. And just unlike what I did last time, I'm going to let these two introduce themselves like I should have done last time. But anyway, introduce yourselves. Not all at once now.
Oh, okay. I'll start, I suppose. Hello, I am Lapis. I am a intersectional feminist, a socialist. I also believe in the importance of conversation. I consider myself fairly moderate on gun control issues, and I'm very interested to have this conversation.
All right, TwoPlebs or Dawn. It's all right that we just call you Dawn, right?
It's fine if you call me Don. I'm Don of the TwoPlebs channel. I noticed the chat seems to basically know who I am. I am really, really far libertarian, free markety, all the guns, all the times, do all the things. So I imagine this is going to go about like everybody expects, but I'm in for the conversation regardless. Thanks for having me.
All right. So,
and happy Veterans Day, everybody, before this kicks off.
Yeah, definitely important. Good, happy Remembrance Day.
All right. So anyway, before we actually get onto the debate, I shall explain the format to everybody. Each debater, originally this was going to be a 2-on-2 debate, now it's just 1-on-1, but each debater will be able to individually start up with their own opening statements, about 5 minutes per person. And let me actually get the timer here. 5 minutes per person. There will be no interruptions or interjections in this. And then at the point of, after each person has went for their 5 minutes, we will then go to responding statements, which will also be 5 minutes. But then also no interruptions or interjections. And then we'll get into 30 minutes of cross-examination, where I will be more lenient on interjections, but there will not be any complete cutoffs. If somebody was interjected, I will let them completely finish their statement.
Kick that other account. I was accidentally in on the wrong account.
Oh. What?
There will be one that says Rowan Armstrong.
Oh, yeah. Eject. Okay. That was awkward. Anyway.
I'm sorry.
All right, so as I was saying, 30 minutes cross-examination will be more lenient on the interjections, but no complete and utter interruptions. And during this whole debate, I must emphasize, I mean, we don't have Cult of Ham here, so it shall not be as much of a problem, but no name calling, no accusations of bigotry, no calling each other a faggot, an asshole, or whatever else have you. All those other insults. And if you do, I will give you a strike. 3 strikes means that the other opponent, your opponent, will go for a full 5 minutes of uninterrupted time to put forth their arguments, etc. And then after the 30 minutes of cross-examination is done, we'll go into like 40 minutes of addressing the chat, or however long that we want to. And then once it gets near to the time that TwoPlebs has to leave, we will go into 5 minutes closing statements. He'll be the first to closing since he has to go soon, and then Lapis, and then that'll be the end of the debate, etc. And also addressing the chat, we will not only address the chat, but it'll also just be extended cross-examination. But anyway, so who would like to go first?
Be my guest.
All right.
All right. So Lapis,
if you want to go first, then I'll go first. I'd say that I'm not really very extreme when it comes to.
I haven't started the timer yet. Now, Lapis, go.
All right. I'll say that I'm not really a very extreme person when it comes to gun control. I don't support. I'm not what some people call, a gun-grabbing liberal. I don't believe that, that the government should come in and take away handguns from ordinary Americans. And I don't believe that Americans should be, that farmers should be prohibited from owning rifles and whatnot. And I'm not necessarily, a huge hater of guns either. I mean, personally, I don't own a gun, but I don't think that you're necessarily a bad person if you do. That being said, I think that there are some common sense measures that can be done to reduce gun violence in America. And I think one of those is a universal background check, applied regardless of whether you are registered by the federal government or not. I believe in that certain weapons don't necessarily belong in the hands of, these, armed militias, like a tank, for instance. I have a hard time necessarily thinking that you should have a bunch of people riding around in tanks everywhere, because I think that creates a power imbalance between ordinary citizens and those who have the resources to buy tanks and other, really dangerous weapons. And so I think that people who, that you should be prevented from buying a tank if you're a private citizen, unless, of course, it's, purely for show or something, like a museum. Secondly, I also believe in a ban on gun ownership when it comes to really extreme criminals. Like, I don't believe that a pedophile or a rapist or a murderer should necessarily be able to purchase a gun. And I don't necessarily believe that someone who has like a long history of mental instability should be able to purchase a gun either. I think that it puts people at risk if you enable these people to purchase guns, and it creates the possibility that they will use their firearms for, to persecute those like they have in the past. I also don't believe that hate groups like the KKK should be able to own firearms because, well, obviously the KKK has been using these firearms, in terrorist actions against Black people, and it's, it's a dangerous organization. And I think that, considering the way that they're using their firearms, it's not necessarily very beneficial for them to be having them. Anyway, those are just a few of my thoughts. So I guess I will, I will surrender my time.
All right, that's over 2 minutes left. All right, cancel. And I will also emphasize people to try to stay on the subject of guns as much as possible. These side tangents, we can address them, especially if they're like closely woven into the subject. But I noticed that you also went on KKK, etc. But if you can like tie that real well into the subject, then no big deal. Mm-hmm. But now we will go on to the 5 minutes for Dawn. So, Dawn,
say when.
5 minutes, start now. Oh, wait, start now.
All right. So, like I said, when I introduced myself, I am pretty much for no gun laws, which I understand is not necessarily a popular view, and I kind of don't care. The premise of people being able to own firearms has inherently to do with their right to self-defense, and if they have a right to self-defense, they should be able to defend themselves however they want. The idea of gun control unto itself is that if we just made something a little bit more criminal, then criminals would stop doing negative things, and that seems self-evidently fallacious. I mean, there is no time in which someone violates a gun-free zone to kill someone that the murder is a lesser charge than violating the gun-free zone or anything even remotely similar. And the premise that we're going to have some sort of massive pre-crime unit, which is another requirement of all gun control, is wholly against the idea of people being able to be free, defend themselves, do any of the things that guns permit them to do. And equally speaking, you come to this kind of problem where it seems to be what it is that we think guns are and what they do. And what they do in the sense of fighting or shooting or any of these other things when it comes in contact with other people is force equalize. There is simply no other way even to frame this that's not at least a little disingenuous, and in my opinion. I apologize. But the simple reality of the matter is that there is no way that a 90-pound 16-year-old is going to fight someone who weighs 350 pounds of rippling muscle without at least some intervening weapon. And that weapon, look, let's face it, the best one for the job's a gun. Outside of that, we encounter this availability problem in our discussion here, which is to say that we all look at mass shootings and go, oh my God, they happen all the time. But They don't, right? I mean, this is a consequence of having a very large and available 24-hour news cycle. And the simple fact of the matter is, in comparison to gun owners, number of guns, days of the week, it doesn't really matter. Mass shootings don't happen that often. And the thing that makes us think that they do is that they're in the news cycle for 2 weeks at a time when they happen. And so we see this and go, it happens all the time. And the problem there is, what would be the correct number? And there is no answer to that, right? I mean, everybody says zero. Zero is not going to happen. But the idea that we could somehow get right next to zero if there was just one more law is continuously proven fallacious by the facts on the ground. I think that's about it. Thanks, Dark.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot of time that you have saved up as well, like 2 minutes, 10 seconds. But anyway. We're getting into like responding 5-minute statements. So Lapis, it is your turn. 5 minutes starting now.
Okay. I think that there's kind of a bit of a conflict here. You seem to be arguing against a position that I don't really hold, that, you know, guns could be eliminated if just another law was passed. I don't believe that guns can be eliminated, but I think that keeping guns out of, you know, dangerous hands is an important step in securing a safe society, which, as you say, it's kind of your goal. You talk about force equalization. I don't necessarily see guns as that. What guns do is that they put force into the hands of those who can afford to pay for the newer device, the fancier device. If we have absolutely no laws on arms, you know, if, say, whoever is rich enough to buy a tank can buy a tank, and there's no restrictions on that whatsoever, then you're going to see the military power in America, you know, force in America, concentrated in the hands of the elite. I think that gun control, in some instances, can be a way of equalizing that. I also believe that it should be applied to the police force. I think the police in America is extremely militarized to the detriment of the population. And I think that, you know, making gun control more universal across all segments of the population is, you know, it is in itself a kind of force equalization. Next, I want to kind of address the issue that mass shootings do not actually happen very often. Well, at least according to The Guardian, mass shootings have happened. There's been 1,624 mass shootings in the past 1,870 days. That's almost one mass shooting per day. Now, I don't know what is considered a lot by American standards, but in Canada, you know, if there was a mass shooting every day or almost every day, that would be a quite concerning phenomenon, something that needs to be executed, you know, something that needs to be stopped. Lastly, I think that kind of pretty much does it up for me, but yeah.
Sorry, you're just trying to look for something?
No, I said I think that pretty much sums it up for me.
Oh,
I think
sorry, I was trying to pay attention.
It's my fault. I didn't make my conclusion a bit clear enough. Sorry.
But anyway, guys, I keep on not using up your time, but well, I don't really care. But still, Don, 5 minutes starting now.
Sure. So I apologize if the opening statement was not framed in some sort of direct response to you. However, I was of the understanding that I should have framed it long before we started. So I don't intentionally mean to be strawmanning you there. I just put it together like a week ago. So no offense intended in that sense. On the other hand, the problem with citing things like The Guardian is The Guardian is most notoriously bad for describing what a mass shooting is. The problem that we have in these discussions like this is that the term mass shooting is very flexible. If you go by FBI statistics, then that number is over an order of magnitude less than what The Guardian is claiming there. If, however, you say that it's 2 people or 1 person killed and 1 injured, you can come up with all kinds of crazy numbers. A mass shooting happens every like 8 seconds if there is if it's 1 dead plus someone else in the vicinity besides the shooter. And so, I mean, if we're going to do that, then most certainly, you know, mass shootings are huge record numbers, but mostly that's because we changed the definition here. I think that's the id of the things that I needed to respond to there. Did I miss anything? I'm sorry. I'll go ahead and absolutely grant you time to say if I missed anything.
No, I think you did pretty well. And just wanted to clarify, no offense taken. I was just, it's understandable that when you prepare ahead of time for a debate, that sometimes you're not necessarily going to be responding exactly to what your opponent is saying.
Yeah.
Wow, this debate is turning way too polite so far. I need some of the spirit of ham in both of you right now.
All right, so
value?
I hate you. Feel free to return, and then we can move along back to cordial debate.
Very anti-Semitic.
There we go.
Fascist. There we go. Done.
Anyway, in all seriousness, now I guess we'll get into 30 minutes cross-examination. You guys ask each other questions all you want to clarify each other's beliefs. What is it that you expect, and rebut those as to how you think that your agenda or each other's agenda doesn't work and why. So 30 minutes cross-examination starting now. Play nice.
Okay, so I wanted to go into the idea that the Guardian is an improper source and that we should instead be using kind of the FBI's version of a mass shooting. So at least on the Guardian article that I was talking about, the Guardian defined as a mass shooting as 4 or more people shot in one incident, excluding the shooter.
Okay, so the problem with that is it doesn't match up with any other data. And so if you're willing to link that in the side chat so I can actually take a look at what it is that they are trying to count, then I think I can speak more intelligently to it. But lacking exactly what it is that they're saying, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that.
Okay, I'll definitely send it to you in the side chat. Now, it doesn't necessarily, like, I think that regardless of whether it's necessarily in touch with the FBI's definition of a mass shooting, that, you know, every 9 to 10 days, you know, 9 out of every 10 days, that 4 people are shot in an incident of a mass shooting in America is a concerning phenomenon. Now, my main concern with gun control is not necessarily mass shootings. That's one component. My main control is suicides. I think there are way too many mentally ill people who are purchasing guns and using it to shoot themselves. Like if we look at the statistics, which I can pull up in just a second, you'll find that the vast majority of gun deaths in America are not actually homicides or mass shootings, but rather suicides.
True. It's roughly 20,000 is the number you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. So to me, that it's mainly men that are doing this because you know, women normally choose you know, drug overdose as a method of attempting suicide, where men tend to opt for more lethal methods. And I think that this is a really concerning phenomenon, that so many mentally ill people are having easy access to guns and using it to harm themselves. And I think that, you know, I'm personally someone who's interested in building a society that is safe for mentally ill people, and that, you know, where they're not at risk as much. I mean, obviously you can't eliminate every single risk, but without, you know, that's why I think universal background checks are important, is because it enables a, you know, the salesman to know whether they're selling a gun to someone who's going to be a responsible gun owner, or whether they're selling the gun to someone who is only interested in taking their own life.
So you run into a lot of problems there. Not the least is that Japan has the highest suicide rate, like anywhere that anyone's tracking, and effectively has banned guns, right? So from this, we can pretty easily learn that if people actually just want to commit suicide, they're just going to do it, right? And as I understand it, the most notorious way to commit suicide in Japan is to jump off a building above 5 stories. So, I mean, under this same pretense, we should get rid of skyscrapers because we know that it contributes to people being able to commit suicide. simple fact of the matter is, if someone wants to kill themselves, they will be able to. Because, I mean, look, there's a bridge not too far from where I grew up that has been ever so slowly implementing more and more and more anti-suicide measures on this bridge, because no matter what they do, people still jump off it and kill themselves because it's something like a 250-foot drop, right? And so if the idea is, well, we need to go after guns because people are going to kill themselves, then we're way beyond treating symptoms as opposed to the cause. And there is a simple reality that while the end result of us saying, okay, people with whatever it is that we determine as mental illness, which unto itself is a problem, can't have guns, we will have lowered the number of people who kill themselves with guns, but done nothing to lower the number of people who kill themselves.
Okay. I'm just looking for a source on that suicide rate in Japan is actually higher than America. But the problem, okay, it's about the same, 14.3 compared to 13.7. And it's worth noting that the Japanese economy has been in a very bleh and weak state for the past, I think like 25 years or something like that, pretty much since the early 90s. And that there are more factors, involved in why there is suicide than just guns. I've never denied that. And I don't believe that we should deprive everyone of guns because it's a risk for suicide. However, it is important to risk manage these things. It's very important, yes, to ensure that mentally ill people have access to care that can help them with their mental health issues. But it's also important to limit risk factors like, guns, like, and you say that skyscrapers are, a similar kind of risk factor. I don't necessarily see it as the case, because I don't necessarily think that a skyscraper provides the same sort of easy, painless death that a death by gunshot does.
I don't know that I don't know that we're doing anything beyond a differentiation without a difference there. To the Japanese suicide rate thing for a moment, the thing with Japan is that their suicide rate has been there or in that general vicinity, 14, 15 per 100,000 for a long time, far predating economic problems. Japan just has a suicide problem and has since at least immediately after World War II. And I say that only because records in Japan on suicide prior to World War II are nearly impossible to come by. And the ones that there are don't seem to have any bearing on reality. It's like there was one town that recorded suicides and okay, but that's certainly not the whole country. On the other hand, their suicide rate doesn't seem to necessarily in any way be attached to economic difficulties. In fact, one of the strange things that behavioral economists have noted for years is that suicide rates, for some reason, go down in seriously bad economic times. Not substantially, but they do in fact go down. And there are all kinds of theories as to why, but regardless, they do end up going down. Back to the subject of skyscrapers, though, we sort of have this this problem where, regardless of whether or not they find it painless, the end result is you push a button, you take an elevator to the top floor, and you jump off. Now, presumably, this would limit people with a fear of heights from committing suicide by jumping off of a building, but the same could be said of a fear of guns. So I don't think the single dissuasive factor of people who are afraid of the method is a good differentiation either.
By the way, I want to quickly interject. If you guys have any sources that you would like to provide, I will provide them in the description of this debate right here. Just provide them in the group chat on the side.
Sure.
Okay, just a second here. Okay, so contrary to what you just described, according to this systematic suicide study by the World Journal of Psychiatry, people found 31 studies found a positive association between economic recession and an increased suicide rate following the onset of the recession. Now, is it worth noting that Japan has a problem with suicide also due to kind of cultural phenomenon that, you know, it's considered kind of the honorable thing to do to commit suicide when you feel yourself disgraced or when you have been defeated, such as many of the leaders in Japan tried to do after being defeated by America in World War II. Yes, I think that's definitely a big thing. However, I don't necessarily see it as a huge infringement on freedom to kind of make sure that mentally ill people, to kind of limit the amount of risk factors in their life, one of which would include firearms. And I do actually agree with you that that's not the only solution. The primary solution has to be more funding for mental health, must be more treatment for mental health, and understanding why more and more people are committing suicide. That's, you know, that's extremely important. But I think that there's things that we can do that maybe might be small things that could have larger impacts on the amount of people who are committing suicide.
Okay, so in the world of yes, Chad, in the world of let's explore this mental health thing, right? So what does that mean when we say we're going to limit who can have guns based on mental health requirements? Is that, I mean, are we talking? I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone agrees that if you're checked into 24-hour care and you have no rights of any kind, that includes gun rights. But I don't think that's gun control. I think that's you know, you clearly are not able to be in control of your life. So we effectively imprisoned you in a nice way, where you're allowed to be a crazy person and not destroy yourself or others. Now, if that's the line of gun control that we're talking, then okay. But I mean, again, I stand behind the idea that that's all rights taken away. So if guns just happen to be one of them, then fine. But it's as soon as we get away from that, right? So is this someone who has sought treatment for depression ever in their life? Is it, I don't know. What is the line that we're looking at here?
I'd say that they have a diagnosis of depression from a clinical psychologist, or especially mental illness that is more serious than that.
Okay, so is this are we quite literally at the line, if you have even once ever been diagnosed with depression, you should never be able to own a gun? Within
the, let's say within the range of 5 years.
Okay, so if I went to my doctor tomorrow and I said, hey, I'm depressed, and they said, okay, you have depression, then I should not be able to own a gun for 5 years. What happens if I own a gun in that circumstance?
What happens already? If you own a gun? Well, yeah. It shouldn't be taken away from you immediately, obviously. But I don't think you should be able to purchase more guns, at least until the, you know, you've been, your mental illness has been treated. You know, so long as gun ownership is not a risk to you or others.
So what is the differentiating line there? Like, I mean, I will go ahead and use me as the precise example, right? So if I went to my doctor tomorrow and I said, hey, I'm depressed and life sucks and whatever. And he said, okay, you have a diagnosis of depression. I have probably at least one of every firearm that everybody thinks nobody should have, certainly not those that are depressed, which is to say a couple of pistols, the big scary assault rifle in the 1994 sense of assault rifle, you know, all of these things. If the point is that you just have to buy a gun beforehand so that you can have guns, aren't we, A, incentivizing people to not seek treatment for depression until they have firearms, and B, if they're interested in seeking buying firearms, not seek treatment for depression?
I think that, well, two things here. I think that if you already sought treatment for depression and then you seek to purchase a firearm, that puts you at significant risk of committing suicide, and that's a big danger, and I don't think that you should be able to do that. In regards to your 2 points, that won't this prevent people from seeking mental health care, they'll just buy a gun and shoot themselves anyway. I mean, I don't necessarily think that's Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second.
Well, let me rephrase the 2 points just to get you back on target then. So aren't we incentivizing people not to seek treatment for depression until they have purchased whatever quantity of guns that they would like to have? And then subsequently, aren't we just in general incentivizing people not to seek treatment for depression because, well, you can't go buy guns? And certainly in relation to the me portion of that was, look, if I have been on the search for a revolver for the last, I don't know, 2 years, is there some logical sense to that I should have an M4, 2 semi-auto pistols, a 12-gauge shotgun, 2 different lever action repeating rifles, but I can't go buy a revolver because I have a diagnosis of depression?
I think that you already have all these guns. I don't necessarily know why you want or need all these guns, but that's besides the point. You know, plenty of people like to collect dangerous things, dangerous pets. But it's definitely important that when you buy a pet, that you should know that the person who is buying the pet is going to be a competent, good owner. And so if you already have a pet is kind of irrelevant to whether you should be able to buy another one. I think it's a similar thing with guns. You know, this latest gun might be, okay, this is the beautiful gun that I've been searching for my entire life. This is what I'm going to use to commit suicide. Some people have that sort of romantic notion. And
okay, I think we're talking the eminent extreme, right? Are we down to, if this saves even one life, then we should do it?
I think that it could save quite a few lives, really. I mean, first of all, I believe that everyone should have access to mental health care if they desire it. You know, I think that.
Sure, agreed. Let's go in general. I'm sure the implementation we would disagree on, but the premise that there should be available mental health care. Okay, let's just go forward, presuming that we agree to that. On the other hand, the incentive structure, I think, is pretty important here.
You mean that people have an incentive if they want to commit suicide not to seek mental health, and that they will purchase a gun instead of seeking it if this legislation is passed already?
Correct. And sorry about the loud noise.
Okay. Well, I mean, much of this legislation already exists in different American states, and there is still a suicide problem in these states. Okay, there's probably going to be still people who are going to plan like this. However, I think a lot of people with depression, I know when I had depression, it wasn't so structured. You know, I sought help, and then for like a few hours or so, I'd have an impulse, like a really powerful impulse to go kill myself. You know, if gun ownership was so easily available in Canada that they wouldn't be able to do background checks, I probably would have killed myself.
Okay. Again, I think we're talking about an eminent minority, and most certainly this is what this is some part. Okay. So first of all, we're talking about a subsection of the populace just by nature of those who are depressed. Don't get me wrong. In the United States, we're talking about a pretty big subsection of the populace, something like 45%. But of that, the question is what quantity, if possible, would immediately go and purchase a firearm and presumably kill themselves in some intensely short order. Now, places we could look to see whether or not this is a viable worry are everywhere with waiting periods. And because presumably that's the issue that we're talking about, right? So you could, my favorite state to hate on, California, has had a 10-day waiting period for something like 20 years. It had no to statistically insignificant impact on the suicide rate of California.
Well, there could have been plenty of other things going on in California, but a 10-day waiting period is not necessarily, you know, to the extent that we're looking for as well. Sorry, I'm getting a bit jumbled here. When it comes to, did it have the 10-day waiting period as well as having mental health background checks?
At various times, yes. Equally speaking, California has a red flag law, has for about 5 years now. Okay. No impacts on this sort of thing.
By the way, Lapis, I have to say, if you're getting distracted by the chat, please subvert away from it.
Yeah. I haven't looked at the chat. I'm sure they're all very critical of my stupidity.
It does seem to be a
Okay.
lot of my subscribers who are unsurprisingly of the same beliefs that I am. So
All right. I understand. I didn't come necessarily into this debate to have a popular opinion. I came into it to have a conversation.
sure.
Okay.
Anyway,
continue.
I don't have opinions just because they're going to be liked by a bunch of people in a chat that I've never met.
Fair enough. Anyway, carrying on.
I think that well, first of all, I'd have to I haven't studied California in depth. I'd have to look into it more to see if I could confirm what you're saying about the waiting periods. All I know is that waiting periods would have probably saved my life.
Now we're talking anecdotal versus statistical. Right?
Exactly, but since you haven't provided the statistics, it's kind of like what you say about the statistics versus my experiences with this, which is fair enough, not really a very strong, neither is necessarily very convincing. I actually just like to see the statistics in general, mostly because I'm a big fan of statistics. But let's also look at, not just suicides, because that's one aspect of why I support gun control, but also homicides. America does have the highest homicide rate in the first world. Meanwhile, countries like Canada have, about half that in terms of suicide rate, and countries in Europe, that suicide rate goes down even further. And in countries like Japan, it's something like America has like an 8 times more people are killed in America than in Japan. And I'll just quickly pull up the suicide, the homicide rate of America compared to everyone else.
So while you're doing that, I get it. There is roughly, I mean, it depends on which year you're talking about, but in the vicinity of 11,000 homicides per year. It's been that way since the 90s. Mid-90s, right? And it goes a couple thousand either direction. And the per capita rate then is mostly related to growth of population. On the other hand, I would note that a moment ago, we were discussing the Japanese suicide problem as a cultural issue because tasteless jokes aside, the Harry Carey when dishonored thing. Equally speaking, Japan seems to have a pretty strict cultural view of the idea that you go kill people. I mean, their violent crime rate has been lower than everyone else's for a substantial period of time, regardless of their gun laws. And this is a thing that you find basically everywhere, right? So there is the eminent comparison that comes up all the time is the US and Britain. There's a simple reality that Britain's homicide rate, their firearm homicide rate, their violent crime rate has been lower than the United States since, well, basically always. And so the premise that gun control laws had something to do with this was, it's a little ridiculous in my opinion, because if your baseline is 3 per 100,000 and then you institute gun control, and it becomes 8 per 100,000, which is basically what happened in Britain. And then it moves back down to 3 per 100,000. And you go, well, ours is lower. Well, it was always lower, right?
But America does have pretty lax gun laws and still has, an enormously high homicide rate for a first world country.
Sure. However, what we also have is a wide variety of gun laws, right? So the premise that the federal government's gun laws are the discussion at issue here is fallacious, right? Again, I come back to California versus, say, Wyoming, which Wyoming effectively doesn't have gun control rate laws and has a homicide rate something like half of Californians. And so
obviously gun control is only one aspect of homicide rate, but it's still an aspect. Wyoming is also an extremely rural state, which rural places tend to have a lower homicide rate.
Yes. However, even in the places that are not rural, what you find is that the correlations pre and post implementation of gun control are not good for the argument of gun control, right? So California's
California. But that, once again, that's kind of an example of anecdotal evidence. You're taking an example, California, comparing it to another example and saying, since it didn't work in this instance, it never works at all.
Well, so, I mean, for the sake of an example, I do need something that is an example, right?
Yeah.
But this is pretty pervasive amongst nearly any comparison you could make. And I only say nearly because I don't know every single one of them off the top of my head. So
I don't think anyone would expect you to.
Right. On the other hand, when I say California, I enjoy California for a few reasons. One, it is my favorite pincushion. And two, it is roughly equivalent in nearly every way to England, right? Or the UK as a whole. It's roughly the same geographic size. It's roughly the same population, except that it's in the United States.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. England has quite a few more, there's no areas of California that want to break away.
Yes, there are.
Well, I mean, I suppose like the West, but not to the extent of like the IRA in North Ireland.
Yes, there is. The northern side of California has been campaigning to be the state of Jefferson since the 1970s.
Okay, but was there a massive bombing campaign that nearly assassinated the British, prime minister in Northern California to break away? Was there anyone who targeted the governor and blew up the hotel, like the Brighton Hotel in England? I don't think California and England are really comparable countries.
Size-wise is all I'm going for here. But in the world of, do they have a precisely I'm sorry?
You mean in terms of like population?
And geographic size. I mean, don't get me wrong, Britain or the UK is a bit smaller than California, but not substantially so.
California has about 40 million people now. The UK has like 64 million, maybe quite a bit higher than that.
The last I looked, population was last year, and we were both in the 38 million-ish vicinity.
You mean, specifically England, not the United Kingdom?
That might be what I'm going for.
Okay.
That's my fault.
I do have to say that we have 4 minutes and 25 seconds left.
Okay.
Then we'll get into it.
I think what might have helped both of our arguments is if we had been able to kind of pull out more statistics. I mean, admittedly, it's my fault because I should have looked at more statistics prior to this debate, because I did actually research the issue at one point. Then I lost the file. Just
that happens. What statistics are we looking for?
I was looking, comparing the homicide rate and looking at various explanations of why it might be. Is it just guns? What other explanations would there be for America to have a higher homicide rate? Say, would income inequality play a factor in a higher homicide rate? Would, ethnic conflicts play a higher role in a higher homicide rate? And I did have eventually a bunch of different statistics, but I lost the file, unfortunately. So what I think I'll do is after this debate, I will put together a video kind of responding to areas where I see myself doing not so well, because I don't think I've done very well in this debate. I mean, I think I've been very polite, but I think that I normally, when I debate people, I have a lot of statistics on hand, but since I lost the file.
Life happens. I mean, are we...
I do have to say that Doragoon in the chat says that he desires more talk of principles. I just thought I'd shout that out.
Oh, yeah. That's another thing. Whether gun control works, I think, is irrelevant to your argument. Like, I think essentially for your argument and for the argument of most pro-gun people, especially in America, it's a question of freedom as opposed to efficacy. In the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms is enshrined in the United States Constitution. And I think that's, it's a very, important thing for most Americans. They care a lot about their Constitution. They want to protect it and preserve it. I think it's difficult for me, who's not an American, to necessarily empathize with that to the same extent that an American would. Because I don't necessarily, for me, if I see something that was wrong in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I'd want it corrected, not kind of enshrined just because it is the way it is.
So, presuming that we had gone to whether or not it's a good idea to violate the Second Amendment because lots of people think it is, the premise that the Constitution is there to remove things from the Democratic vote would have come up. However, we didn't go there, and I didn't need to. And I mean, my personal preference on whether or not you should be able to own a tank, I tend to find irrelevant. And that I think freedom is generally a good idea is also irrelevant. Gun control either needs to be an efficacy discussion, or we need to just admit that what we're doing is throwing our own personal preferences around and just hoping that enough people agree with us. And I think that unto itself is a problem with nearly all gun control debates, because as often as not, it is when you hear people debate it, it's just, well, but I like X. And that's why I haven't said anything about why I like X, because it doesn't matter what I like, right? And again, if we want to discuss whether or not the Constitution is important, it most certainly is. The premise of that document in its entirety was to take things out of democratic control, and the pretense being that if enough of the country agreed, then we could put it back under democratic control. But other than that, I think the Second Amendment argument has almost no bearing on the efficacy discussion.
Let's wrap it up. We got less than a minute cross-examination.
I definitely agree with what you're saying there, because ultimately, whether I think a lot of people don't find the Constitution to be a very compelling reason for something or against something, because the Constitution has changed various times throughout history, often to oppose the very freedom that you would protect. Like right now, you're drinking beer. I think it's Monster. But say you were drinking beer in like 1920, that would have been prohibited by the Constitution, the constitutional amendment. That constitutional amendment was later removed. The Constitution is a fluid document, I think. Whether the Second Amendment is useful or not useful is...
That's the timer right there. Finish up, Lapis, and then we'll get to the chat.
Is the aspect of discussion here. Not necessarily that it's wrong to repeal an amendment. Although I think that since the more important value, I think in your case, is that it's an instant, it's about freedom, right?
Well, so I'm going to make this as quick as I possibly can so that we can move on to addressing the chat. So the Constitution being fluid, there's a way to amend it. And if we want to amend it, then we will. And if the ideas were as popular as we suggest that they are, when we do things like say, 9 billion% of people think it's a good idea to restrict Second Amendment rights, then we would amend the Constitution. But that's not what we do. And the idea that we're just going to read different things into it than what used to be there means that it is effectively worthless.
All right. So getting to the chat, I have written down some of the chat comments that kind of stood out for me. So note, everybody, not every single one of your chat comments are going to be addressed, but first things first, we have our favorite subscriber that visits us pretty often, Red Feather. She asks, and I don't know if you would actually want to address this, Lapis, or play devil's advocate for it, but Red Feather asks, I would like to know how we go about getting all the guns. I don't know if she's talking about...
Yeah, well, I don't believe in getting rid of all guns, so that's like, it's not really the point of the question, right? I think that probably the less guns there are, the better off people are as well, because it's a lethal weapon. The less people running around with lethal weapons, I think probably the safer everyone would be. In a similar way that I think the less nuclear weapons there are in the world, the safer off people would be. But I don't think that my opinion on whether guns should be around or not be around is worth necessarily having some officer come up to your house and confiscate your property. I obviously, your personal property. I do think that personal property is important to preserve. I don't believe in private property, but personal property is definitely something worth protecting.
Right. That would be kind of a subject for a different time. Yeah. Maybe you two can debate economics at some later point. But Sean said that he isn't going to be available for mid-December or something like that. But anyway, Dorgoon01, I do not know of who specifically this was addressed to. It might have been mostly Lapis, but he asks, how many people would have to be saved to justify a gun control law?
Well, I guess that's an interesting question. Mostly because it does take a lot of time to actually pass a law. And if you could pass another law which would save more lives during that time, wouldn't that be more worthwhile? So I don't know. That's an interesting question. Maybe 5,000, 10,000.
Can I make a suggestion that if you drill down into American data, you're simply not going to find that's feasible. The closest we could get to even coming near that would be enforcing laws we already have on the books, and nobody wants to do that either. So,
All right. So, third chat comment in here. So Nope asks a question in regard to your own legislative agenda, I think, Lapis. In fact, most of these chat comments are more directed to you. Nope asks, if you buy a gun 10 years before killing yourself, then what do we need, an 11-year waiting period?
No, I think that the problem there is primarily, and as I said, I think that gun control can play a part in reducing suicides, but I think primarily what is needed is a public health care system which provides mental health care to any who need it.
All right. So anyway, Mad Catter also asks, so some people have mental illness and the rest of us need to cater to them? I mean, what is that, like a misconstruing of your own agenda, or do you have to like
well, I mean, you mean that people have to go through background checks because some people have mental illnesses or a criminal history? Well, I think that I think that might be it. The cost there is not really too much. You know, maybe it will take an hour of your time. Maybe it's not really a huge violation to have to.
This seems like a thing that is just a lack of understanding of the current law. The United States has had the National Instant Check System since, I think, 1998 when the Brady Bill passed, though that might have been 94, I forget. And it is quite literally instant. You are talking 10 seconds for a background check. What we do or do not include in there is may or may not suit your wants and needs. However, the simple fact of the matter is felons buying guns legally in the United States does not happen. So if a felon has a gun, it is an illegal ownership of a gun.
Just a second. There is something I want to check here. I know you don't like PolitiFact, and I'm sure you're skeptical of the talking point of the gun show loophole.
Sure.
But federally licensed gun sellers, they're required to run background checks, but not all sellers are required to be licensed, and unlicensed gun sellers can appear at gun shows.
You want to provide that article in the group chat here, by the way, Lapis?
Sure, I can.
So there's a lot of weasel word space in what you just said there, right? So if I personally take my guns and I set them on a table at a gun show, I can sell them personally. If you consistently sell firearms, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives will come down to you and say, you don't have an FFL3. And there is a certain number of guns that it is, which I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's something rather small. It's like 5 in a year or something like that. And if Batfee catches you selling more guns than that, they come down and they arrest you for attempting to be a firearms distributor without an FFL3.
But you're against this law, aren't you? You're against any sort of federal license. You're for no gun control at all.
You got it. I mean, I'm not arguing whether or not it fits my preferences. I'm saying it's already there.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that it is there. Based on the data that we're looking at here. So it says that those with federal firearm licenses only make up to about 50% of the guns vendors at gun shows, to about 75%. That's still a good 50 to 25% that don't have a federal license selling their guns at a gun show. That means that technically you can buy a gun in the United States without undergoing a background check.
yes, you technically can buy a gun without undergoing a background check, but you are talking about sales that are happening at, well, private transactions is what it comes down to. And I'm presuming you've never been to a gun show in the United States. What you end up with is more often than not, people quite literally just walking around with a gun on their shoulder that has a for sale tag on it. And yes, those transactions can occur without a background check. The premise that there is some sort of large quantity of sales going on here is fallacious, right? Furthermore,
that's not backed up by the data, though.
Yes, it is. So certainly no one is
then what data would you say is superior to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms?
So they're not talking sales. They're talking about whether or not there are people sitting there with guns on a table selling them, right? And so this is where the stats game gets played. If I go to my local gun show, well, I can't because California has universal background checks. But if I lived in Wyoming and I went to a local gun show and Bob from down the street has 3 guns on the table that he's trying to sell, then Bob can sell his 3 guns. The idea that Bob is comparable with guns, bullets, and beers, or whoever it is that actually owns a storefront who's going to make 60 sales that day is what I'm talking about this being fallacious.
But if 22% of people who purchase guns at gun shows or stores or elsewhere underwent no background check, that's about 1 in 5 people who do not need to go through a background check in order to purchase a gun.
You're making an assumption that gun shows make up some vast quantity of gun sales in the U.S., and they simply don't. There aren't enough guns at gun shows to
gun shows,
with
stores, or elsewhere, according to the professor of health sciences and epidemiology at Northern University. It's simply factually false.
Well, how do you mean? So a little bit of that is arguing that we know what we don't know.
One at a time.
Without a background check. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I didn't either. I'm sorry. Say that again.
I think there's some over-talk between the both of you, but yeah, go ahead, Lapis.
Okay. A national survey of 40,000 non-institutionalized adults found that 22% of people who purchase guns at gun shows, stores, or elsewhere underwent no background check, said Matthew Miller, professor of health sciences and epidemiology at Northeastern University and co-director of the Harvard Injury Control Research Center. When these research excluded purchases between family and friends, that number dropped to 15%, which equates to approximately 5 million gun owners whose most recent purchase did not involve a background check. To me, this is a problem. I think you should be doing background checks when you sell guns, and that includes on family and friends. I mean, like a lot of these shooters have actually gotten their weapons, because they were bought by a family member as a present or something. That's how what's-a-face, the one who did the, oh God, what was that shooting in 2013 in Massachusetts? The
Sandy Hook?
Sandy Hook, yes. His gun came from his mother.
Yeah, but he killed his mother and stole her guns. There was no background check that was going to help that situation.
Well, I mean, it would have been kind of useful to know that she had a mentally ill son who could have accessed her weapons.
Well, so it doesn't matter if you have a mentally ill son or not. If someone is willing to kill you and take your firearms, I mean, there's simply no law that is going to stop that. Once again, because we have crossed this line where, murder, clearly a more stringent law in any way, shape, or form than any other law that we're going to put on the books, has been violated in preparation for theft, a more stringent law than violating a background check, in preparation for large quantities of murder.
The thing here. If you have a mentally ill person living at home with you who can have, who could access your firearms and use them to kill you, that is something that people should know about before they sell you an arm.
I don't think that's the thing you could viably know.
I don't necessarily see how. If you have someone that is mentally ill at home and you ask this question, they're like, okay, yeah, actually, my son does suffer from mental illness. Okay, maybe then we can't sell this gun to you. I think that makes sense. It doesn't necessarily seem to be a huge overstretch.
So the premise there is people would say yes. I don't know what else to say here.
You mean that they would that they would never, you know, that they wouldn't necessarily think. So you think that, you know, okay, I understand. Yeah, obviously people lie, but I think that there are people who are honest, and that would reduce the number of guns. I think that could have a, you know, people who are honest do exist as well.
Well, sure, but if we are talking about groups of people who are even peripherally attached to those that are going around killing large sums of people.
Don, I'm going to let you finish, but then we're going to go back to addressing more of the chat.
Okay. Yeah, and
look, the premise here, like, well, because I live in California, it doesn't matter. I have to have a gun safe. But the premise here that someone irresponsible enough to leave ready access to firearms to someone who has severe mental health problems is equally going to be responsible enough to go, when they purchase said things initially, yeah, totally, there's someone who lives with me, when there's not a verifiable list to check this against. And even if they're, even the methods we have that are verifiable aren't accurate in any way, shape, or form. I mean, there's a reason that everywhere in the country you can get a ticket for not living where your driver's license says you live, right? And it's because people live other places than where their driver's license says. Now, both of these things cannot be true.
All right, so from there, I'll go back to the chat. So that was a long time trying to address just Mad Catter's last chat comment that I'd read. But then we have like two more that I thought were worthy of reading. Nope says, mentally ill person could break into your house, better not have guns in your house. And Red Feather also asks, I think she might be a little bit confused on specifically what you want, Lapis, but she says, so now people who has families that have mental illness can't have guns?
No, I'm saying that if they live with you, that should be a factor in whether you are able to purchase more guns. Or at least, if a mentally ill person is living with you, there should be more rules about how you keep your guns in order so that your property stays away from the mentally ill person who could use the gun either against themselves or against others.
Again, I think you run into a little bit of reality of the situation here. So, for example, in California, I'm required to have a safe that is approved by the state of California, submit the serial number to that safe to the gun dealer when it is that I purchase a firearm. And I equally have to have a separate locked container to store my ammunition in, because this is all California state law. And again, none of this is impacting the situation in any way that anybody wants it to. I mean, over the weekend, we had a mass shooting in California. It's not stopping these things. I get the want to do something. The problem is when something has been done, it does not produce the desired results.
Okay, so...
All right, I'll let you address that, Lapis, and we'll go back to the chat.
I don't necessarily, like, once again, since you're not actually pointing to any data, like, there was just a mass shooting. Well, I think there's been, like, 5 mass shootings in Canadian history. It doesn't necessarily mean that gun control hasn't significantly reduced it. I mean, there's been 5 mass shootings in Canada, but that's since 1880, not, you know, almost every day. As we can see, looking at the statistics, happens in America. You know, every day in America, there's an incident where someone, well, almost every day, 9 out of 10 days, there's an incident where someone shoots 4 or more people with a gun, not including themselves. You know, that's a significant problem. And I think that gun regulation can do something about that. But ultimately, since, you know, you have not provided statistics and my list of statistics on how gun control has impacted that, there's nothing really that we can provide here.
Well, so
whenever you're in a debate with Lapis, she'll grill you on not having news sources, but yeah.
Well, look, I mean, they're readily available at the UCR from the FBI. California's homicide rate has not had any substantial up or down tick other than what was already going on across the rest of the country. And being 10% of the country, we're certainly not guiding the entire nation's gun crime, specifically homicide rate. And that's been true since literally forever. Equally, to address the Canadian thing, I note that your lack of mass shootings predates your gun control laws. So if that is the case, it would seem to be a cultural issue as opposed to a gun control issue.
You know, gun control in Canada has been around like since gun control has. I don't really want to get into this history argument whether, you know, because the history of gun control in Canada is kind of a complicated topic. But
right, and so
suffice to say, there isn't a gun culture in Canada.
All right,
not like America.
So back to Red Feather in the chat. Also, who gets to actually no? And never mind, I'm not going to address that chat because it's that chat comment because it seems kind of I don't know, superfluous or something.
Okay.
Gun does not make people choose suicide. It's just a tool. I don't know if you want to address this, Lapis, but a gun does not make people choose suicide. It's just a tool they choose to use. This from Peter Pleb in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, obviously guns do not make people suicidal by some sort of like magical radiation. However, a gun is a tool that people can use to commit suicide. It's a tool that many people choose to use, and having it readily available to people, I think, it would increase their risk of suicide.
All right. Red Feather also asks how many suicides are caused by guns. She's asking about the stats, I guess.
Well, I think TwoPlebs already mentioned that suicide makes up the majority of gun deaths in America, about 20,000 a year. So every 10 years, that'd be about 100,000 people who commit suicide with a gun in America.
Every 5 years.
5 years, yes, you're right.
Okay. Nope says, okay, this is going to get kind of crass and a little bit brash, I think, but I still think it's just a kind of a legitimate argument that he brings up. He says, I don't care how people kill themselves. That's not an argument to me. Ban all drugs and poison in buildings over one story and bridges and trucks to jump in front of and cliffs for that matter and rope.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I'm not interested in banning all guns. I'm interested in harm reduction for people who are mentally ill. Primarily, I think that the issue is, you know, TwoPlebs is right about that the issue is not primarily guns, but rather that the lack of affordable mental health treatment in America. Yeah, primarily, I think that the issue that the suicide rate could primarily be reduced by a universal healthcare system where mentally ill people can have access to treatment whenever they need it. However, I still think that this, you know, the idea that a gun is not a risk when you're a mentally ill person is just wrong. Like, I think that if you're suffering from depression and you know that you want to end your life and you have a method of ending your life really easily within grasp, that is a danger, you know, in a similar way that a skyscraper really is not, mostly because a skyscraper, jumping from a skyscraper is an extremely painful way to die, and it's also an extremely safe way to die. So that leads to a possibility of many people trying to stop you. That it's not necessarily the same with a gun. You can easily shoot yourself in the privacy of your own home and no one will notice. Meanwhile, if you go to the top of a skyscraper, that's immediately attracting everyone on the street who can see you. I think it's a very different dynamic.
Not really. I'm just going to guess this is not a thing in Canada, but visiting the roofs of skyscrapers is actually a pretty common occurrence for some reason in this country. I don't necessarily understand it, but I do know that it happens a lot. Nearly every major city with lots of skyscrapers has at least 2 or 3 that roof access is a pretty big deal. Parties on the roofs of these things that are just open invite and all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, it's a really common thing. And the premise that someone's on top of a building, therefore people will care. I have serious doubts. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not me providing any evidence or anything, but I have serious doubts that something that happens here every day will drive a lot of interest from people at large.
But it's different to have a roof party and then a single individual person in the middle of the day, stepping towards the edge of a roof.
You say that, but again, I mean, window washers, I mean, there's people work, electricians. I mean, there are a pretty constant stream of people on top of skyscrapers all the time.
They're normally engaged in some sort of activity which can be seen, less so for someone who's just randomly standing at the very brink of a skyscraper.
Well, the presumption here is that, on my behalf, is that it would be the intervening time that would matter. This thing that you see in movies where people just go to the edge of a skyscraper and stay there for 40 minutes doesn't tend to happen with people who actually want to commit suicide, which, I mean, this is a line worthy of drawing, in my opinion. People who are doing things that get them attention for being suicidal tend not to actually commit suicide, vice those that actually commit suicide tend to be rather successful and on first attempts. Limitations to that are drug overdoses, simply because we have a amazing medical system that can save your life if you're in the middle of a drug overdose.
Well, I mean, I'm pretty critical of America's healthcare system, but I don't necessarily agree. I think there's sometimes, like, once again, neither of us are really providing any sort of statistics here, so it's difficult to really parse through whether each is a valid argument. Like, how long does someone who actually wants to commit suicide versus someone who's less sure about it? It's like eventually it becomes like an increasingly vague and really hard thing to pin down.
Sure.
All right. So going further on crime stats, Miss Murder says something regarding Japan. I guess we mentioned Japan a little bit earlier. She says, by the way, Japan is known to fudge its crime stats a lot. The U.S. has a larger population than a lot of countries. Yeah.
Okay, but I'm judging it based on a homicide rate. So, by every 100,000 people, how many people are killed, deliberately murdered? By that statistic, it wouldn't necessarily matter how many people are living in Japan compared to the United States. The rate would stay pretty much the same.
Right. Look, it's badly phrased, and while I appreciate the support, we come again back to how has this been forever, and what we continuously find is that the gun control was nearly irrelevant, and usually in the short term bad. Again, there's a lot of problems with stats in Japan pre-World War II because, well, that's what happens, right, with world wars, for the same reason that a lot of German stats prior to World War II are not readily available. Mm-hmm. But and France has some problems with it too, being paved over. But regardless, the areas where you have very large gun control instituted, the stats prior to the gun control being instituted are often effectively the same, and there is almost always a short-term jump in violent crime immediately after serious gun control is implemented.
Okay, since neither of us are providing, since I haven't looked at those stats, I can't judge whether you're right or wrong. And I think I'll do a response video after this,
sure,
to kind of fact check it, because I'm sure you're telling the truth, or at least a side of the truth. Because honestly, I think that the truth is kind of something that's hard to pin down. Normally, when you have a political conversation, there are usually two sides to the issue, whether it's effective or whatever, ineffective, blah blah blah. You can find sources both ways.
Yeah, and make sure that you share with the rest of us that debate review that you plan on making.
Yeah.
Doragoon01 says, by state or country, there's no correlation between homicide rate and gun ownership.
Well, America has the most guns in the first world. It also has the highest homicide rate in the first world. However, that's more of a correlation than a causation. And I think that's what you'd have to look at there.
Don?
I think the premise that's being got at here is that other countries all around the world have various eminently stricter quantities of gun control than the U.S., and the corollary between their homicide rates and their gun control is non-existent, right? countries that have super incredibly strict gun control don't have any different homicide rate than what they had had prior. And again, these things, it depends on where you go. I am certain there is some example in which the average here is wrong, but the premise that like lots of gun control was implemented and then all of a sudden the murder rate went down is just not found anywhere.
Well, once again, I don't necessarily have a specific example of where it did happen or where it didn't.
I'm sorry. Chat is saying county, not country,
Okay.
in relation to this, which makes this an American problem again.
It's a bit weaker because to talk about county laws because they're overrode by state laws often. So
Yeah.
you could have gun control in Detroit, but it wouldn't necessarily be effective if there's extremely loose gun control laws about 20 miles outside of the city.
In my opinion, to address that chat comment myself, I think it's a little bit more effective to be talking about by country than by county because county is like so microscopic of well, aside from cities, is so microscopic of an area to be keeping track of stats, etc. I mean, it's easier to keep track of the bigger cities, but individual county by county, some of the counties are so sparsely populated that they just lump them in with the entirety of the state instead of actually make them their own individual stat, you know, as compared to big cities like Chicago, Detroit, etc.
I don't even know that I know any specific county gun control laws other than wherever it is that runs Chicago. On the other hand, you still end up with a problem that if by county, by state, take your pick, if the guns are the problem, why is it the surrounding areas with less gun control don't have the problems, right?
All right. Fat Samurai Production says, and the both of you can like argue this and fact check it if you want. He says in the chat, Chicago has the strictest gun control laws, and yet they have the most gun deaths in the country. Now, somebody in the chat had addressed him on that, but I'm going to give you two the opportunity to address that yourselves.
Well, once again, by going by city is not very effective because if you can purchase guns by just going 20 minutes outside the city, people will just do that and then bring the guns back to the city and use them there as opposed to purchasing them within the city. If you want gun control to be effective, you have to kind of apply it universally, not kind of sporadically in different counties. That wouldn't be an effective model, I don't think.
So again, you would need to address why County A that has strict gun control, but County B that does not, County A has lots and lots more homicide rate, where presumably County B has, I don't know, loose laws and thus more guns. Now, if the premise is that people in cities like to get in gang fights and kill each other, and they'll do whatever they can to get guns anyhow, I would point out that selling these people guns is called a straw purchase and is already illegal. So that, I mean, that's not going to, adding another law is to duplicate the effects of one already on the book, not a good thing. And outside of that, there is still the issue where Chicago has the problem, but no neighboring county does. And whereas it used to be Chicago city limits had the problem, it has expanded some as suburbs have been attached to that. But really, I think Southside Chicago makes up almost all of Illinois' gun crime. And the rest of Illinois does not have anywhere near as strict of gun control laws as Chicago does.
Well, obviously, because gun control isn't the only issue, but it's still an issue. And if you have loose gun control laws in counties, not, in counties that are outside of the county where the gun deaths are occurring, those laws won't be effective.
Yeah, and then you would have to this would kind of transition into the issue of movement laws. And by movement laws, I mean kind of the bigger issue of immigration, but just movement laws in general, like from county to county within the same country, or even from country to country, or city to city, etc.
So yeah, I'm going to spell this out as clearly as humanly possible. The violence in Southside Chicago is specific to Southside Chicago. That is a cultural problem of Southside Chicago, and that is not overcome in any way, shape, or form ever by gun control laws. By that I mean, if gun control was the thing that fixed it, then Chicago would have done it already, because we're already breaking the law. More importantly, though, is that the places that you find almost all of the U.S.'s gun crime, specifically in homicide, though armed robbery and all these things correlate equally as well, is in places where, presumably in advance of the gun control laws, because, well, let's face it, most of these cities have been like this forever. I just got stats from the 30s of Chicago, of all places, and that's prior to the very first federal gun control law in the U.S., and their homicide rate was always ridiculous. So Chicago, being a horribly murderous, violent hellhole, is unaffected by gun control laws.
Well, that's because we keep going back to this issue. I don't believe in applying gun control by county basis, because I don't believe that's effective. I think you would have to be federal, or at very least state, in order to be effective. And secondly, Chicago, I think, is in a kind of a nasty state, less because of gun control, or not because of gun control, but because of economic problems in the city, and because for a long time, at least especially in the 30s, it was kind of the center of crime in America. It was the center of organized crime, and people who were selling illegal liquor, or illegal at the time. And then from there, organized crime developed kind of a base in Chicago and in New York. And that's why these cities are violent. I don't believe in the reductionist argument that crime is only because of guns. I think that having a lot of guns in your country and having easy access to guns makes it easier for criminals to perpetrate crimes. And it makes it makes people more vulnerable if they're surrounded by guns, if if everyone is constantly getting involved in firefights, and if it's just how you make a living by stealing from other people. Obviously, this is a problem.
Wait, Don. I'm gonna end off with that right there. And the reason why I keep on giving Lapis more of the last word on these little sub issues here is because she is debating against you, and plus there's the
chat seems to be on my side.
The chat is
everyone agrees on your side, mostly because they're your followers.
Yeah, so I'm trying to make it so that I can give Lapis a little bit more floor time here, in all fairness. But
the transgender thing.
Oh yeah. I'm trying to make up for your victim points, but anyway. Getting serious now. There are two other issues that I want to address in regards to what was said in the chat. It was like 3 chat comments rolled up into one issue, and then there's another completely on its own. All right, so this is kind of getting on a sub issue or tangent, whatever you want to say, of trans issues and back to mental health. So kind of walking a fine line here. So I hope that we can all stay nice here. Mad Catter says, are you a mental health professional? Because if you were, then would also know that trans people have an incredibly high suicide rate, both pre and post-op. Should they not be able to own guns? That's the first one, and then there's 2 more. Lapis?
Well, I think that part of the reason that transgender people have a high suicide rate is due to a lot of the social pressures that they face. I think it's observable that the transgender, but after transition, trans people have a much lower suicide rate than they did previously. And I think that you shouldn't necessarily discriminate against a population because they have higher mental health illnesses. If you are someone who's suffering from a mental health problem, I don't think that it's wise for you to have a gun, because I think that it makes you a risk to yourself, and depending on the extent of your mental illness, a risk to other people.
So, forgive me here, but this seems like there's always going to be some set of reasons for any mental illness, right? I mean, having depression is correlated with lots and lots of things, some of which is genetic, some is life circumstance, on and on. So, I mean, if it's, well, we should limit the number of people who have depression specifically, right? Or a higher instance of suicide, unless they have an excuse for that. Well, everybody has an excuse for that. So if the premise is to be applied at a federal or even state level, that if you have an increased suicide rate, and depression does, right? And so does transgenderism, then regardless of the reasons, wouldn't that still apply? Wouldn't it still be, well, yeah, but you have a higher suicide rate. So because we don't want people killing themselves, then no guns for you.
No, it's looking at specific conditions like depression, not based on whether you're trans. You can be a trans person who's transitioned and be completely happy and secure in your life without depression.
Well, you can be depressed and get along just fine, right? I mean, millions of people do it every day.
Mm-hmm. But you can also, being depressed is, in particular, a risk factor for suicide in a way that just being transgender without being depressed is not.
The transgender suicide rate is super high.
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
of all the discrimination and hate that people get for being transgender. That's the issue.
I find the reasons irrelevant, right? I mean, there are reasons for depression, and some of them are good, some of them are bad. A lot of that's just a value judgment on each of our behalf. But regardless, there are reasons. And so if there are reasons, then doesn't this law just not mean anything? Or is it that we, to just put a point on it, have we just crossed a line where you find this to be personally different, and therefore we should base policy on that?
I think that the issue here is that if you're depressed, it's a risk factor for suicide. If you, the reason that trans people have a higher rate of depression is because they are persecuted. Remove the persecution, you'll get rid of that higher rate of depression. And, also it's because, it's simply harder to have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to be in the correct body rather than just being born into it.
Okay, this is getting a little bit into the side tangent, but I want to ask a question to try and clarify something. Lapis, you did not say earlier, or did you say earlier, that people who are prone to suicide should be prevented outright from having a gun?
I said not everyone who has the slightest risk of suicide, because that would be everyone. I said specifically people who have, serious mental health problems, like depression, should be prevented from purchasing a gun, not stripped of the guns that they already own, because it puts them at risk when they own a gun and they have depression.
Wouldn't that same reasoning apply to transgender people?
No, because transgender people have a higher rate of depression.
Let's not talk at the same time now.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, the reason that would not apply is because not every transgender person is depressed. There is a higher rate of depression among transgender people. That does not mean that every single transgender person is depressed. And you should judge it based on whether they have depression, not based on the fact that they are transgender.
Well, what is the differentiation here? The premise is that having depression has a high suicide rate, and so to stop people from killing themselves, we should stop selling them guns. Under this logical argument, or this logical stand-up, this would be true about transgender people.
No, because transgender people have a higher risk of having depression. That's the reason they're more likely to commit suicide. Just judge it based on whether they have depression or not judging all transgender people as, immediately extremely mentally unhealthy. That's,
Why are we judging all people with depression as being immediately having serious mental health problems? I mean, because the numbers for people with depression come down to... we include things like seasonal affective disorder in there, which personally I think is bullshit, but it's in the depression list, right? The premise is the seasons change so you get depressed, and under your premise of law here, for 5 years, if that was the case, they shouldn't be able to buy a gun.
Well, maybe I have. I don't necessarily think that if you're feeling a bit blue, that's necessarily the same thing as clinical depression. I have clinical depression. It's not at all the same. It is a very serious mental health condition. It's not, oh no, the sky is gray, I'm feeling a bit sad. It's, I literally want to kill myself every day.
Okay, well,
all right.
Look, go ahead, Dark.
So I want to I don't want this to turn into a full-fledged discussion on whether or not transgenderism as a broad generality is definitely a mental disorder. I want this to mainly pertain to guns. Duragoon. Wait, no.
You know what? Not to cut you off, but I think we've hit that time. I got about 15 minutes before I got to start a stream. So.
All right. Sorry, I wish that we could have addressed more of the chat. I don't know. Maybe we'll just let Lapis stay a little bit longer afterwards. But I guess we'll get into closing statements right now.
Okay.
TwoPlebs. Wait. I'm gonna start the timer here first.
Well, based on our both of our usage of time, Lapis can absolutely go. That's fine. I have again about 15 minutes, and I don't think Lapis is going to talk that long.
All right, so I guess since Lapis did start first, she can go ahead and start first in closing statements as well. So Lapis, you want to go?
Okay, if that suits you. I think that the discussion here has been very interesting. I think that it's definitely interesting to hear about different people's personal experiences living in states with high gun control and not seeing that affect their homicide rate. However, I think that the problem with this discussion has been a lack of statistics to back up, what you're saying, and also to back up what I'm saying. Unfortunately, I've done my best to find what I can in, the time that I've had, but I think that the loss of that file was an extremely, something that I extremely regret. And I think it's kind of weakened the strength of my argument. I definitely respect TwoPlebs for his beliefs. I definitely have a lot of admiration for libertarians for their respect for freedom, and in general for Americans for their desire to live in a country that is governed by a constitution and that is governed by an overwhelming respect for the freedom of every single individual. However, I think that freedom also entails responsibility, and one of those responsibilities is to ensure that people are not suffering so much, and that is what is happening in America due to this gun crisis, to this rash of gun violence that kills so many in America every year. And I think that common sense gun legislation, like preventing, people with severe mental illness from purchasing guns, like preventing murders, pedophiles, and rapists from purchasing guns from unlicensed salesmen, is something that America can work on, and that is something that should be universally applied, and not with these little tidbits and exceptions. And furthermore, I think that we need to kind of move away from the idea that owning things gives us power and freedom, and that by necessity, a gun makes you powerful, and that by necessity, owning, say, a huge plot of land makes you important. These things, like this idea that ownership makes the human, I think is completely backwards. I think it's our own beliefs, it's our own expressions and our own ideas which truly make us individuals, not the commodities that we own. Anyway, thank you for your time. I hope that everyone gained a little out of this discussion. I probably didn't change any minds because I don't think I presented a very good argument, but I did enjoy this discussion, and I did enjoy hearing from all of you and presenting your thoughts on my arguments, and I'll definitely adjust them in future. So thank you very much, Dark Khan, for having me on, and thank you, TwoPlebs, for having this discussion with me.
All right, so that's 1 minute and 45 seconds there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we were good on time.
maybe you can like when you do your review, you can like go back and look at the most of the chat. I mean, it's a pretty long chat right now. But anyways, two plebs, your 5 minutes closing statement starting now.
So I think a lot of this comes down to well, ignorance of the laws that are already on the books. Like, don't get me wrong, I do fight for there to be less to no laws on the books, but there are things that, again, because they have basis in the Constitution, I would let stand, like felons being not being able to purchase guns. Regardless of whether or not the due process clause was a good idea, it's there now, and therefore you can have your constitutional rights stripped by due process, which is what felons can't own a gun means. On the other hand, to the actual ignorance portion of this, if any felon is in possession of a gun, and I mean like at all, like you're holding one, that's a crime. The premise that we don't have background checks or that anybody doesn't know this, right? If you're a felon, they tell you flat out you're not allowed to buy a gun. Welcome to being a felon. So again, laws on the books being enforced, equally speaking, is as much as it would have been nice to have like a murder heat map. The simple fact of the matter is, no matter how much you drill down into gun crime, specifically homicide in the United States, is what you find is that it's in very specific places and in huge numbers. And when amalgamated into the entire national statistic, it makes it look like America's a war zone or something comparatively. But the simple reality is that, for example, Chicago had 700 and then 670 gun homicides in 2015 and 16 respectively. Now, that is, out of those that are not police shootings, about 10% of all of the homicides in the United States, just in the one city, right? And this continues to be a problem in every major city, and it's always going to be until they address whatever else it is, which is to say the rampant crime that goes on there. And none of those cities are doing that, so it's not really helping. In fact, the giant federal task force that went into Chicago is the primary differentiation between 15 and 16 for their homicide rates, at least in my opinion. And prior to that, we had an ever-rising Chicago homicide rate. So in a shocking turn of events, when you crack down on violent crime, it starts to go away. Anyway, the other things of relevance here, I have actually enjoyed this. I usually get a lot of angry retorts, and there haven't been much. So thank you very much. I enjoy the courtesy. It's been strangely cordial. So I am perfectly happy to do this again at some point if we need to. I will go ahead and check out the rebuttal video, and I will see if I can't put together. I mean, I've been trying to put together one of like all of the homicide stats, but the FBI is screwing me around on a FOIA request, so I'm missing the 60s. So at minimum, it'll happen then. But I'll check out the response video. We'll see if we can't find out what's going on in these various places. That said, thanks everybody for watching. I hope we all had an enjoyable debate out there in the chat. I've been halfway watching you, and you guys are a little bit spurgy, but still funny. So thanks for having me, Dark. It's been a heck of a time. Once again, everybody, happy Veterans Day. I need to get out of here because I'm now down to sub 10 minutes before I need to start my own stream. So I will see all of the chat that is from here over there in about 10 minutes.
All right.
All right. Yeah, so, hopefully we can do it again sometime. Yeah.
Thanks for joining, Don. And to all of you in the chat, sorry that this could not have been a little bit, I don't know, I guess just a little bit more passionate. If you want a much more passionate gun debate, search up the debate of Colt of Ham versus DBTK. It's a little bit earlier in the Strike Force playlist on my channel page. It should have like a thumbnail that has like a green banner right next to a pig with the versus symbol in between them and like two pistols being crossed towards each other. Check out that debate, and I will try to do a little bit more of these debates. Maybe we can like next time have the Effeminate Degenerate and Dawn of Two Plebs talk about economics next, or who knows what else that we'll talk about. And Lapis, for all the rest of your sources that you had read, I got the Guardian source right here, and I'll link it down below in the description. But all the other sources, please provide those in the
I'm doing that right now. I'm sending them to you. Google chat or which chat do you want me to send them?
You can do it either way. Well, actually, it's probably best to do it in Twitter DMs. But anyway,
that's what I'm doing right now. So 1, What is this based on?
All right. So anyway, I think I'm going to like go off the air here pretty soon, y'all. Thank you all for joining, and big thanks for TwoPlebs Talk News for shilling this stream. This is like the largest audience I've ever had on a stream of my own. And so anyway, I am your host and moderator, the Dark Conservatarian. I'll see you all later. And again, thank you, Lapis, and God bless you all.